The Texas sun was merciless in late July, baking the sprawling grasslands of the Pendleton Ranch into a pale, golden crisp. Arthur Pendleton stood on the wide timber porch of his ranch house, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. At 67, his frame was still as unyielding as the oak pillars supporting the roof overhead. He wore his usual attire, a faded denim jacket, oil-stained boots, and a Stetson hat that had seen more rain and dust than most men see in a lifetime. For 3 years, this place had been his sanctuary, a quiet kingdom of rolling pastures, white picket fences, and the rhythmic, comforting sound of thoroughbred horses trotting in the distance. It was a peaceful life, an earned life. Or so he had chosen to believe. The tranquil silence of the afternoon was abruptly shattered by the aggressive roar of an engine. Down the long, gravel driveway, a cloud of white dust billowed into the air, trailing behind a brand-new, polished black Cadillac Escalade. The luxury SUV tore through the ranch gates without slowing down, its tires spitting gravel against the pristine wooden fences. Arthur didn't move an inch. He didn't set his coffee down. He simply watched through narrowed, storm-gray eyes as the vehicle swerved to a halt right in front of his porch, cutting off the path to the main stables. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Kevin, Arthur's 40-year-old son. Kevin looked entirely out of place in the rugged Texas backcountry, wearing a tailored linen shirt, expensive Italian loafers, and designer sunglasses that reflected the harsh glare of the sun. He looked anxious, his eyes darting toward the passenger side before he even made eye contact with his father. Then came the passenger door. Chloe Pendleton stepped out, her high heels instantly sinking into the dry dirt yard. She clicked her tongue in immediate annoyance, shaking her foot to dislodge the dust from her designer shoes. Chloe was 38, a former socialite from Austin who spent money like water and treated the rest of the world like background actors in her personal reality show. She took one look at the rustic ranch house, rolled her eyes behind her oversized sunglasses, and marched toward the porch steps, dragging a massive, monogrammed suitcase behind her. "We heard you bought this gorgeous horse ranch in the valley, Arthur," Chloe barked, her voice cutting through the warm air like a rusty blade. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she ask how his health was. Instead, she shoved her heavy suitcase across the wooden floorboards of the porch, the hard plastic wheels scraping loudly against the polished timber. "We decided it's about time we move in. You know, to leave all those silly little grudges and misunderstandings behind us. Family belongs together, don't you think?" Kevin followed closely behind her, carrying 3 more overstuffed bags. He kept his head low, looking at the floorboards, the railing, the horizon, anywhere except at his father's face. The guilt radiated off him in waves, but it was heavily masked by a practiced, submissive silence. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression completely unreadable. The warmth of the liquid did nothing to melt the ice that had instantly formed in his chest. "Chloe, Kevin," Arthur said, keeping his voice low, steady, and perfectly pleasant. "What an unexpected surprise." "Move in, you say?" "Oh, absolutely," Chloe said, already pushing past him into the grand entryway of the house without waiting for an invitation. She stood in the center of the vaulted living room, her eyes darting from the hand-carved stone fireplace to the antique leather furniture. Arthur knew that look. It was the cold, calculating gaze of a predator pricing out a meal, or in Chloe's case, a real estate opportunist mentally assessing the square footage and market value of a property. "Reunited at last, Pop. We've been way too distant lately. And like I always tell Kevin, family is everything." "Family is everything," Arthur repeated. The words tasted like ash on his tongue. For a fleeting second, Kevin finally met his father's gaze. Through the reflection of the midday sun, Arthur caught a glimpse of something raw in his son's eyes, shame, perhaps, or a desperate plea for help. But before it could materialize into a real conversation, the look vanished, replaced by the blank, obedient stare that Chloe had meticulously trained into him over 7 years of marriage. "It's good to see you, Dad," Kevin murmured, his voice lacking any real conviction. "Is it?" Arthur asked mildly. Chloe let out a high, brittle laugh that echoed sharply against the cedar-beamed ceiling. "Oh, Arthur, always the stoic cowboy, always with the dry humor. Now, which wing of the house is ours? We've had a dreadfully long, exhausting drive from Austin, and I desperately need to freshen up before dinner." Arthur smiled, a genuine, slow smile that crinkled the edges of his eyes. It was a look that usually signaled a done deal in his boardroom days, a smile that completely unsettled Chloe for a fraction of a second. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a trap, but her arrogance quickly smoothed over the suspicion. "Of course," Arthur said warmly, gesturing toward the long eastern hallway. "Let me help you too with those heavy bags." As Kevin and Chloe struggled with their excessive luggage in the corridor, bickering in hushed, angry whispers about which suitcase belonged in the master's suite, Arthur stepped back into the shadows of the entryway. He slid his hand into the pocket of his denim jacket. His fingers brushed against his smartphone. He had pressed the screen the exact moment he heard the roar of the Escalade coming down the driveway. The recording app was already running, capturing every whisper, every scraping wheel, and every arrogant demand. Arthur walked out to the porch to look at the dust settling over his yard. The first hour of this family reunion had already been highly educational. He knew they hadn't driven all this way out of a sudden burst of filial piety. They were here for something specific, and they thought an old man living alone in the country would be an easy target. Arthur leaned against the porch railing, watching a hawk circle the blue Texas sky. The game had officially begun, and unlike his son's ambitious wife, Arthur knew exactly how it was going to end. The heavy scent of cedar and pine inside the eastern wing did little to ease the tension building within the walls of the ranch house. As the muffled sounds of Chloe arguing with Kevin about closet space drifted down the hall, Arthur walked into his private study. He shut the heavy oak door behind him, cutting off the noise, and stepped toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the breeding pastures. Outside, a magnificent black stallion sprinted along the fence line, its muscles rippling under a coat that shone like liquid obsidian. Arthur watched the animal, but his mind was miles away, wandering through the decades of sweat, grit, and sacrifice that had built his fortune. He wasn't born into a world of sprawling ranches and million-dollar trusts. At 18, he was washing soot from his face and breathing in thick smoke as a rookie firefighter in the toughest districts of Dallas, earning a minimum wage that barely covered rent and a hot meal. He had looked death in the eye more times than he cared to remember, carrying people out of collapsing structures while the world burned around him. That job taught him two things: how to stay calm when everyone else was panicking, and that a single second of hesitation could cost you everything. When a back injury forced him out of the department in his early 30s, Arthur took his small savings and risked it all on a single, beat-up oil tank truck. He spent the next 32 years building Pendleton Logistics from the ground up, turning that one truck into a massive fleet that dominated the distribution networks of Texas. He had fought through cutthroat corporate raiders, corrupt city officials, and brutal economic recessions. 3 years ago, when a major energy conglomerate offered him $5.2 million for the entire enterprise, Arthur decided it was time to hang up his suit. He had earned his peace. He had bought this ranch not as a show of wealth, but as a sanctuary where he could return to the earth, breed world-class horses, and read his collection of leather-bound historical journals by the fire. He had built a legacy, but as he stared out at the sun-drenched pasture, a bitter pang of regret tightened in his throat. He had built an empire, but he had failed to build a son. Arthur remembered when Kevin was just a boy, a freckle-faced kid who would sit on the front porch for hours, waiting for the rumble of Arthur's truck to echo down the street. The moment Arthur stepped out, Kevin would sprint across the lawn, his small arms reaching up, yelling, "Dad! You're home!" The boy wanted to know everything about the trucks, the routes, and the drivers. He used to proudly tell the neighbors that he was going to run Pendleton Logistics one day. That boy had a spark in his eyes, a natural curiosity, and a sense of pride. Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He didn't know exactly when that boy had vanished. The shift had been subtle at first, a gradual erosion that began 7 years ago, the moment Chloe Kelly entered Kevin's life. Chloe was a sharp-tongued real estate agent from Austin who saw Kevin not as a partner, but as a ticket into a tier of wealth she could never achieve on her own. Within a year of their marriage, she convinced Kevin to leave his role at Arthur's company, claiming a mid-level corporate manager position at an IT firm in Austin was more prestigious than working in his father's shipping yard. Slowly, the phone calls from Kevin dwindled. Weekly check-ins became brief monthly obligations. Monthly obligations became short, awkward texts on major holidays. Chloe systematically filed down Kevin's edges, removing his confidence, his ambitions, and his spine, until he became nothing more than a quiet shadow following her from one high-end boutique to another. The true awakening, however, had happened exactly 1 year ago. It was an incident that Arthur would never forget. He had dialed Kevin's number on a quiet Tuesday evening, intending to ask him about a local horse show. Kevin must have pocket-answered the call, because instead of a greeting, the line remained open, transmitting the ambient sounds of a high-end restaurant in Austin. Arthur was about to hang up when he heard Chloe's voice, dripping with an icy blend of contempt and impatience. "Is that old man still kicking around in that big house?" Chloe had sneered, her tone sharp enough to cut through the static. "When is he finally going to sign over the trust and stop being such a financial burden on us? We need that ranch capital, Kevin. My credit cards are maxed out." Arthur had held the phone to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting desperately for his son to speak up. He waited for Kevin to defend him, to tell his wife that his father was not a burden, to display a single shred of loyalty. Instead, after a long, agonizing pause, Kevin's muffled voice replied, "Soon, probably. He's not getting any younger, Chloe. Just give it time." Arthur had hung up the phone. He sat in the darkness of his study for nearly 2 hours, staring at the wall as the weight of his son's betrayal settled into his bones. 32 years of grueling labor, of building a multi-million-dollar inheritance, and his own flesh and blood was simply treating him like a countdown clock, waiting for him to die so they could cash in on his life's work. That was the night Arthur stopped being just a grieving father and became a strategist once again. He started paying attention, really paying attention. He monitored the family accounts, noted the erratic patterns of Kevin's distant behavior, and waited. Then, 4 months ago, a curious phone call from Dr. Mitchell, an old friend from the country club, confirmed his worst fears. Mitchell had hesitated before revealing that a woman claiming to be Arthur's daughter-in-law had been asking highly specific, probing questions about Colorado and Texas guardianship laws, specifically the legal process required to have an elderly relative declared mentally incompetent and stripped of their financial autonomy. Arthur had thanked his friend, hung up the phone, and immediately made a few calls of his own to a private firm in Houston. Now, standing in his study 3 days after their sudden arrival, Arthur looked at the thick manila folder resting on his mahogany desk. It was labeled Pendleton Case File. He opened it, glancing at the surveillance photographs and financial records his investigators had gathered over the past few weeks. He looked back out the window as the sun began to dip below the Texas horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the grass. Chloe and Kevin thought they were entering the home of a vulnerable, lonely old man they could easily manipulate and gaslight into submission. They had no idea they had just walked into a carefully constructed trap. Arthur closed the folder, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. The ghost of his naive, trusting past was dead. The battle for his ranch, his fortune, and his dignity had officially begun. The first 3 days of the family reunion were a masterclass in passive-aggressive occupation. Chloe did not waste a single hour before she began attempting to redecorate the ranch house, treating Arthur's home like a property she had already won at an auction. On the second morning, Arthur walked into the great room to find her draped over his antique leather sofa, barking orders into her phone to a designer in Austin about replacing the custom-woven Navajo drapes he had purchased from a local artisan in Marfa. "These rustic curtains look so incredibly Darther," Chloe said, not even looking up as he walked past her the kitchen. "They make the whole living room look cheap and dark. I know a fabulous interior coordinator in Houston who could completely transform this space. Bring in some modern marble accents, brighten up the wood." Transform. Arthur repeated the word in his mind, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. It was an interesting choice of vocabulary. What she really meant was transforming a $5.2 million historical estate into an environment that suited her superficial tastes, ready for the day she managed to get her name onto the deed. "I'll think about it, Chloe," he said aloud, his voice smooth and untroubled. Kevin, as expected, was entirely useless. He spent most of his time trailing 2 steps behind his wife, nodding along to her every complaint like one of those plastic bobblehead dogs people put on their dashboards. When Chloe complained that the ranch's satellite internet was too slow to stream her high-definition lifestyle vlogs, Kevin immediately turned to Arthur. "She's right, Dad. The infrastructure out here is pretty ancient. You really should look into upgrading to a dedicated fiber line. The place needs some serious updates." Kevin wouldn't meet Arthur's eyes when he spoke. He stared instead at his own expensive loafers, his voice hollow. Arthur looked at him and felt a deep, familiar ache. He remembered a different Kevin, a 12-year-old boy standing in the shipping yard after hours, carefully practicing how to back up a trailer between 2 tight orange cones. "Is this straight, Dad?" the boy had yelled out the window, his face flushed with pride. "Perfect, son. You're a natural," Arthur had told him. That boy had a spine, an opinion, and a dream. Somewhere along the way, Chloe had surgically removed every single piece of it. On the afternoon of the third day, Arthur decided to conduct a small experiment. Before heading out to check on the stables, he deliberately left a set of recent financial documents on the kitchen island, specifically the official property appraisal for the ranch, displaying the $5.2 million valuation in bold, black ink. He walked out the front door, circled back through the side mudroom, and went into his private study. Leaving the heavy oak door cracked just a quarter of an inch, he watched the kitchen island through the gap. Within 15 minutes, Chloe drifted into the kitchen under the guise of pouring herself a glass of iced tea. Her eyes locked onto the manila folder instantly. She paused, looking around the empty hallway to ensure she was alone. Then, with practiced speed, she slid her smartphone out of her pocket. Click, click, click. She flipped through the appraisal pages, photographing every single document, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. A cold, sharp smile played on her lips, the smile of a thief who believed they had just pulled off the perfect heist. Arthur leaned back against the wall of his dark study, his expression completely blank. He almost felt a flicker of pity for her. She thought she was being exceptionally clever, entirely unaware that she was dancing exactly to the tune he had written for her. Later that evening, Arthur announced at the dinner table that the country air was making him restless, and that he was going to take the truck into town for a long, late-night drive to clear his head. "Might be gone for a few hours," he noted casually. "Oh, take your time, Dad," Chloe said, her smile all teeth. "Don't worry about the house. We'll hold down the fort." Arthur didn't drive into the local town. Instead, he steered his heavy pickup truck onto the interstate, heading straight for the glittering skyline of downtown Houston. 2 hours later, he was riding an elevator up to the 15th floor of a high-rise office building on Louisiana Street. The glass doors of the firm read, "Reynolds & Associates, Elder Law and Estate Protection." Marcus Reynolds was waiting for him. Marcus was in his mid-50s, with sharp, calculating eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair at his temples that gave him an air of absolute authority. He didn't build his reputation by being soft. He specialized in protecting wealthy seniors from financial exploitation and handling high-stakes estate disputes. He shook Arthur's hand firmly. "Mr. Pendleton, you said on the phone this was turning into an emergency." Arthur sat down in the leather chair across from Marcus's desk and laid out every piece of the puzzle. He told him about the pocket-dialed phone call from a year ago, Dr. Mitchell's warning about close inquiries into Texas guardianship laws, her recent behavior at the ranch, and the photographs he had just watched her take of his financial records. Marcus listened intently, not interrupting once as he took precise notes on a yellow legal pad. When Arthur finished, the attorney leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his chin. "Texas takes the exploitation of at-risk and elderly adults very seriously, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a professional, reassuring cadence. "But guardianship and incompetency cases can get incredibly messy in court. To pull this off, Chloe and Kevin will need to present medical evidence from a licensed physician stating that you are cognitively incapable of managing your own affairs, your estate, or your medical decisions." "Which is a flat-out impossibility," Arthur replied, his voice hard as flint, "because there isn't a damn thing wrong with my mind." "Exactly, and that is our primary advantage," Marcus said. A cold smile touched the corners of his mouth. "But we cannot just sit back and wait for them to make a move. We need to go on the offensive. From this moment on, you document everything. Record every single conversation you have with them. Texas is a one-party consent state, meaning as long as you consent to the recording of your own conversations in your own home, it is 100% legal and admissible." Marcus paused, leaning forward across the desk. "Furthermore, I think we need to bring in external eyes. I know a private investigator based out of San Antonio, Carla Summers. She's a former homicide detective, incredibly discreet, and she specializes in financial asset protection. If your daughter-in-law has been building a case against you on the outside, Carla will dig up the paper trail." Arthur nodded, the name etching itself into his memory. Carla Summers. They spent the next 2 hours mapping out a preliminary defense strategy, coordinating schedules, and preparing for the inevitable storm. By the time Arthur walked back out to his truck, the Houston sky was pitch black, and the drive back to the ranch would take him past midnight. He didn't care. For the first time in months, the heavy fog of betrayal had lifted, replaced by the cold, familiar clarity of a man preparing for war. He drove through the dark, winding Texas backroads, the distant headlights of oncoming semi-trucks reflecting in his rearview mirror. He thought about his company, the thousands of high-stakes logistics decisions he had executed over 3 decades, and the simple truth that had guided him to success. You don't wait for a fire to burn your house down. You smother the sparks before they can catch. Chloe and Kevin thought they were dealing with an old, isolated target. They were about to learn exactly what kind of man had built the Pendleton empire from nothing. 4 days had passed since their uninvited arrival, and Arthur had learned more about the depths of his family's desperation than he ever wanted to know. The domestic Cold War had reached its boiling point, and it was time to shift the battlefield from silent observations to a direct, crushing confrontation. On the 4th morning, as the scent of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, Arthur found Kevin and Chloe sitting at the breakfast table. Chloe was furiously typing on her tablet, while Kevin stared blankly into his mug. "Family meeting," Arthur announced, his voice booming slightly in the quiet room, carrying an authority that made both of them snap their heads up. 10 o'clock sharp in the great room. "There are some incredibly important matters regarding the ranch and the estate that we need to discuss face to face." Arthur watched as Chloe's eyes lit up instantly, flashing with the unmistakable greed of a gambler hitting a jackpot. She exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Kevin, a look that practically screamed, "This is it." He's breaking down. It's the inheritance talk. Of course, Pop, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she neatly closed her tablet. We'll be right there. Family communication is so vital. They practically sprinted to the great room at exactly 10 o'clock, settling into the oversized leather couch with expectant, rehearsed smiles plastered across their faces. What they didn't know was that Arthur had been up since 5:00 a.m., meticulously arranging the room for maximum psychological impact. He had positioned 3 heavy timber chairs directly facing the couch, creating an interrogation-like barrier. Resting squarely on the rustic coffee table between them was a thick, ominous manila folder with the words Pendleton Case File stamped across the front in bold, black block letters. And waiting quietly in the adjacent study, ready to enter exactly on his cue, were 3 individuals Chloe and Kevin had never met in their lives. Arthur stood by the large bay window, his back to them as they got settled. Before we dive into the details of the estate, Arthur began, turning around slowly, his face a mask of cold calm. I'd like to introduce a few colleagues of mine who have been assisting me with some highly confidential family matters over the past few weeks. He nodded toward the arched hallway. Marcus Reynolds entered the room first, briefcase in hand, dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit that radiated professional intimidation. Behind him came Nathan Price, a licensed Texas notary, a dignified, gray-haired man carrying a formal leather portfolio. And finally, walking in with a measured, watchful stride, was a woman in her mid-40s with short, dark hair and the piercing, calculating eyes of someone who had spent 2 decades staring down criminals. It was Carla Summers, the private investigator. The moment the trio stepped into the light, the expectant smiles froze on Chloe and Kevin's faces. The color drained from Chloe's cheeks so fast it looked as though she might faint right onto the cushions. Kevin's mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal. "Please," Arthur said, gesturing toward the couch with a polite nod. "Stay seated. We have a great deal of ground to cover." Carla Summers didn't waste a second. She stepped forward, picked up the thick manila folder from the coffee table, and opened it right in front of them. She pulled out a high-resolution surveillance photograph and slid it across the polished wood. The image showed Chloe standing outside a professional medical complex in downtown Austin. The signage in the background was perfectly clear: Dr. Patricia Holbrook, MD, Psychiatry and Geriatric Mental Health. This was taken exactly 3 weeks ago, Carla said, her voice entirely neutral, professional, and chillingly detached. Your daughter-in-law made 2 separate, unannounced visits to this psychiatric clinic. According to our intelligence, she was making detailed inquiries regarding the specific legal and medical processes required to have an elderly family member evaluated for severe dementia and cognitive decline. Chloe found her voice, though it was frantic and pitched an octave higher than usual. This is an outrageous invasion of privacy. You can't just hire freaks to follow me around in public and snap photos of me. It's illegal. Actually, Mrs. Pendleton, Marcus Reynolds interjected, stepping forward and opening his briefcase. Under Texas law, there is absolutely no reasonable expectation of privacy in a public space. Photographing an individual entering a commercial building from a public sidewalk is entirely legal and admissible in a court of law. Before Chloe could fire back, Carla pulled out another stack of documents, spreading them across the table like a dealer revealing a losing hand of cards. I have also legally obtained the digital footprint and search history logs linked directly to your home IP address in Austin over the last 4 months. She pointed to the highlighted lines on the printouts. The search queries include: how to force a parent into legal guardianship in Texas, how to have an elderly relative declared mentally incompetent, average timeline for Tu Quyen Kong Dun, stripping financial autonomy of an aging parent, Kevin's face had gone from pale to a sickening shade of green. He looked at the papers, then up at Arthur, his lips trembling. "Dad, please, I can explain. It's not what it looks like." "Can you, Kevin?" Arthur asked, his voice incredibly quiet, yet carrying the weight of an iron anvil. "Because I would love to hear the explanation for this." "We were just worried about you," Chloe shrieked, recovering from her shock and violently going on the offensive. She stood up, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur. "You're 67, living all alone out here in the middle of nowhere with dangerous horses. We wanted to make sure you were being taken care of. By taking total control of my finances, by attempting to have a judge declare me legally incompetent so you could seize my life's work." Arthur kept his voice level, almost conversational, which only made the atmosphere in the room heavier. "That is a fascinating definition of taking care of someone, Chloe." Chloe turned her wrath toward Marcus Reynolds. "This whole thing is a setup. You've been spying on us, recording us since we got here. That's a federal crime. We'll sue you. We'll sue this whole damned firm for everything you're worth." Marcus didn't even blink behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Texas is a one-party consent state, Mrs. Pendleton. That means any conversation can be legally recorded as long as one participant in that conversation agrees to it. Your father-in-law consented to record his own conversations in his own home. It is entirely legal." "Furthermore," Carla added, dropping one final piece of paper onto the pile, "I have the verified telephone logs of a call you made 4 months ago to Dr. Richard Mitchell, a close friend of Mr. Pendleton. On that call, you explicitly lied, claiming your father-in-law was suffering from severe episodes of confusion and memory loss, and you pressed him for information on how to bypass standard evaluation procedures." Arthur watched Chloe's face cycle through a desperate wheel of emotions: shock, explosive anger, panic, and finally a cold, calculating stillness. She realized she had been outmaneuvered, but she wasn't ready to break. She sat back down, her jaw tightening into a rigid line. "Fine," Chloe hissed, her voice hardening into pure venom. "So we were exploring our options. That isn't a crime. We are his family, and we have every legal right to be concerned about Arthur's mental state and well-being." "You have a right to be concerned, ma'am," Marcus Reynolds agreed, his tone dropping like a guillotine. "You do not, however, have the right to commit fraud. Attempting to manipulate medical professionals to declare a mentally sound adult incompetent specifically for the purpose of financial gain constitutes the attempted criminal exploitation of an at-risk elderly adult under Texas law. In this state, Mrs. Pendleton, that is a Class 3 felony." The word felony hung in the air like heavy smoke. Kevin looked as though he was going to be physically sick right there on the rug. Chloe's jaw. "We haven't filed a single piece of paperwork with the court," Chloe whispered, her eyes narrow and sharp. "We haven't made a single official legal move. You can't charge us with attempting something we didn't actually execute. You have nothing." She had a point, and Arthur could see the ugly, arrogant confidence slowly creeping back into her eyes. She thought she had found the loophole. "You're entirely right, Chloe," Arthur said, stepping away from the window and walking right up to the edge of the coffee table. He looked down at them, his presence completely dominating the room. "You haven't crossed that legal line yet. Which is the only reason I am giving you a choice right now." He leaned in closer, his gray eyes burning into hers. "Pack your bags. Get off my ranch, out of my valley, and out of my sight by sunrise tomorrow morning, and I will consider this matter closed. If you choose to stay, I will unleash every legal, financial, and criminal avenue available to me. I will ruin you." Chloe stood up slowly, smoothing down her linen blouse and adjusting her designer sunglasses onto her head. She looked at Arthur with absolute contempt. "We're not going anywhere, Arthur," she said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "This is your son's inheritance, and he has a right to be on this land. We are family, whether you like it or not. If you try to evict us, we will fight you in front of a judge. We'll tell the court you're a paranoid, delusional old man who hires private spies to stalk his own children. Let's see how mentally stable a judge thinks that is." Without waiting for a response, Chloe turned on her heel and marched out of the great room, her high heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. After a long, agonizing moment of hesitation, Kevin stood up, kept his eyes glued to the floorboards to avoid his father's gaze, and silently followed his wife out of the room. True to her venomous promise, Chloe did not pack her bags. Instead, she and Kevin dug themselves into the ranch's eastern guest wing like ticks burrowing into leather. Over the next 2 weeks, the Pendleton estate became the arena for a grueling, silent war of psychological attrition. Chloe stopped pretending to be the doting daughter-in-law. She moved through the house with a haughty, entitlement-fueled arrogance, acting as if she had already won the deed in a courtroom battle. Arthur refused to be a prisoner in his own home. When he called Marcus Reynolds the following morning to discuss immediate eviction strategies, the attorney's assessment was a harsh reality check. Texas property law is notoriously complicated when it comes to familial house guests. Marcus explained over the secure line from his Houston office. Because you technically allowed them to cross your threshold and stay for a few days, they aren't classified as simple trespassers. Standard, rapid eviction protocols don't apply here. To legally force them off the land, we have to file a formal unlawful detainer lawsuit through the county court. In this district, that process could take weeks. If Chloe's new representation plays dirty with continuances, it could drag out for months. Months? Arthur's grip tightened on the phone, his jaw clenching as he stared out at his horses grazing in the morning mist. The thought of breathing the same air as those parasites for months made his stomach turn. But as the anger flared, his old firefighter instincts overrode the emotion. If he couldn't legally cut the fuel to the fire immediately, he could certainly starve it of oxygen. He could make their prolonged stay at the Pendleton Ranch an absolute living hell. The economic blockade began at noon. Arthur walked out to the main utility shed behind the stables and personally cut the fiber-optic internet line and canceled the premium satellite television package for the guest wing. He labeled it under the guise of personal austerity. When Chloe stormed into the kitchen an hour later, her face flushed with rage as she realized her devices had lost all high-speed connection to her social media managers. Arthur was calmly reading a historical journal. "What is the meaning of this, Arthur?" Chloe snapped, slamming her hands onto the marble countertop. "The Wi-Fi is completely down, and the satellite box in our room isn't receiving a signal. I have an interior design consultation over Zoom in 10 minutes. Arthur didn't look up from his page. He slowly took a sip of his black coffee. "Budget cuts, Chloe," he replied, his voice flat and devoid of empathy. "I'm an old man living on a fixed retirement income now. I have to fiercely prioritize my operational spending out here. High-speed streaming is a luxury I can no longer justify." Fixed income. Chloe practically spat the words across the counter, her eyes flashing with venomous disbelief. "You sold Pendleton Logistics for over $5 million cash. Don't play the broke old man with me. And I plan to make every single penny of that capital last until the day I am buried," Arthur said, finally raising his cold, gray eyes to lock onto hers. "Unlike some people in this family, Chloe, I actually know how to manage money and live within my means." The look of unadulterated fury on her face was almost worth the entire ordeal. Next came the rationing of supplies. Arthur stopped buying groceries for the entire household. His double-doored refrigerator, usually stocked with premium cuts of Texas beef, fresh organic produce, and high-end cheeses, was systematically cleared out. He purchased a heavy-duty padlock, installed it onto a separate commercial freezer in the pantry, and labeled the few containers inside with his own name in thick, permanent marker. "You're both fully grown adults," Arthur told a hollow-eyed Kevin that evening, when his son hesitantly crept into the kitchen to ask what the plan for dinner was. "You're 40 years old, Kevin. I'm entirely confident you and your wife can figure out how to feed yourselves without relying on my pension." Chloe tried to retaliate by driving into the local town, buying her own expensive organic groceries, and attempting to use Arthur's high-end Viking kitchen appliances to prepare her meals. Unfortunately for her, she quickly discovered that the ranch's infrastructure had suddenly developed a string of highly inconvenient, mysterious malfunctions. The digital temperature control on the dual convection oven became wildly erratic, running scorching hot 1 hour, burning her baked chicken to a crisp, and barely reaching room temperature the next. The heavy-duty garbage disposal in the sink began making a terrifying, metallic grinding noise whenever she flipped the switch, rendering the sink useless. Even the premium dishwasher mysteriously leaked soapy water all over the hardwood kitchen floor midway through its cycle. Nothing Arthur did was dangerous, of course. He wasn't a monster. But it was an administrative nightmare for a woman who had spent her entire life having everything handed to her on a silver platter. "You need to call a certified technician to fix this garbage kitchen immediately, Arthur," Chloe shrieked one evening after smoke from her ruined dinner filled the hallway. "I will," Arthur murmured, turning a page of his book without a shred of urgency. "I'll get right around to it, whenever I find the time." The grand finale of Arthur's domestic warfare was the execution of the roof repair project he had been deferring for nearly a year. He called up a commercial roofing contractor he had known from his logistics days, a man who ran a rugged crew and deeply understood the value of an early start. At exactly 6 a.m. the following Monday, a flatbed truck loaded with timber, ceramic tiles, and heavy equipment roared into the driveway. A crew of 8 construction workers climbed onto the roof directly above the guest wing. Within minutes, a deafening symphony of pneumatic nail guns, heavy industrial hammers, and tearing metal echoed through the rafters. The violent vibrations rattled the light fixtures in Chloe's room, making sleep completely impossible. The brutal, unyielding noise continued from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. "Sorry about the racket, son," Arthur told Kevin one morning in the kitchen. Kevin looked like a walking corpse. Dark, bruised circles hung heavily under his eyes, and his hands shook so violently he could barely pour sugar into his mug. But a man has to maintain his property. "This horse ranch is going to appreciate drastically in value once the structural roofing is finalized. You'd want that asset protected, right? Seeing as you're so desperate to inherit it one day." Kevin just stared at his father with hollow, defeated eyes. Unable to summon a single word of retort, he grabbed his mug and shuffled back down the vibrating hallway like a ghost haunting a construction site. Arthur watched him go, taking a slow, satisfying sip of his coffee. The psychological perimeter was closing in, but on the outside, Carla Summers was about to uncover a piece of evidence that would shift this war into a deadly new territory. While the domestic Cold War raged within the cedar walls of the ranch house, Carla Summers was working tirelessly across the state, digging through the dark underbelly of Chloe Kelly's past. On a Thursday evening, as the deafening noise of the roofing crew finally subsided for the night, Arthur's private line rang. "Arthur." Carla's voice came through the encrypted speaker, sharp and controlled. "I've been tracking the digital and medical breadcrumbs Chloe left behind in Austin and San Antonio. We have a massive update, and it's going to make your blood pressure spike." "Give it to me straight, Carla," Arthur said, sitting down at his desk. "Chloe didn't just visit Dr. Holbrook 3 weeks ago," Carla revealed, the rustle of case documents audible over the line. "My deep dive into the medical insurance logs shows she has actually consulted with 4 separate geriatric psychiatrists and mental health specialists over the last 6 months. She used a different alias for the initial inquiries, but the billing accounts trace back to a dummy LLC she registered under her maiden name." Arthur's eyes narrowed. 4 different doctors? Yes. And she spun the exact same narrative to every single one of them. She claimed she was the primary caretaker for an aging, wealthy relative who was exhibiting severe cognitive degradation, violent mood swings, and a total inability to manage millions in financial assets. She was systematically shopping for a specific clinical diagnosis, Arthur. She was looking for a doctor desperate or corrupt enough to sign off on the emergency legal paperwork without performing a thorough, in-person cognitive evaluation on you. She was building a premeditated paper trail, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a dangerous octave. Exactly. This wasn't some desperate, spur-of-the-moment scheme born out of their current financial crisis. This was an engineered, methodical conspiracy that she began plotting over half a year ago. She knew exactly what bureaucratic levers she needed to pull to make an emergency guardianship stick in a Texas courtroom. Arthur thanked Carla, hung up the receiver, and sat in the silence of his dark study for a long time. He watched the final rays of the Texas sun bleed out behind the distant mountain peaks, thinking about his son, the treacherous woman his son had brought into their family, and the terrifying coldness of their betrayal. 6 months of calculated groundwork. 6 months of waiting for him to drop his guard. They had entirely underestimated his resolve. But he had to grimly respect one thing. Chloe wasn't just a spoiled socialite. She was a patient, predatory thief. 3 days later, the trap clapped shut from the outside. A white process server vehicle drove down the ranch's gravel driveway at noon. A man in a plain suit walked up the steps and handed Arthur a thick, legal-sized envelope bearing the official wax seal of the Travis County District Court. Arthur recognized the format before he even slit the paper open. Inside was a formal ex parte petition for emergency involuntary guardianship, filed jointly by Trenton Kevin Pendleton and Chloe Kelly Pendleton on behalf of their allegedly incapacitated family member, Arthur Pendleton. The legal language inside was devastating. It cited acute cognitive decline, highly erratic and paranoid behavioral patterns, and a demonstrable, dangerous inability to safely manage high-value personal and corporate financial portfolios. The petition requested that, due to the immediate risk of asset dissipation, the court appoint Kevin as the temporary emergency legal guardian with immediate, absolute authority over Arthur's medical care, his living arrangements, and every single one of his bank accounts and investments. Arthur read through the horrific lies twice, slowly, letting the cold weight of the words settle into his mind. Then, he placed the document flat on his desk and looked out at his stables. They had actually crossed the line. After the warnings, after the evidence he had thrown in their faces at the fireplace, they had chosen to double down on their greed. They truly believed an old firefighter didn't have the stomach or the stamina to fight them in a public courtroom. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus Reynolds. They filed it, Arthur said, his voice as steady as granite. Emergency guardianship petition. The court process server just dropped off the paperwork. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Marcus spoke, his tone wasn't panicked. It was sharp and predatory. Good. Excellent, in fact. Arthur frowned slightly. Good? Now they have legally committed themselves to a definitive fraud they cannot claw back, Marcus explained aggressively. They have submitted verified lies under oath to a Texas judge. We no longer have to play a waiting game on defense, Arthur. It is time to launch the counteroffensive. I want you to pack a bag and get down to Houston immediately. Arthur looked out the window. High above the cedar trees, a lone golden hawk circled the hot Texas sky, patient, calculating, and utterly lethal. I couldn't agree more, Arthur said, his jaw tightening. Call Carla. Call Nathan. Let's show these parasites what happens when you try to burn down the life of a man who built his empire from ashes. The concrete jungle of Houston felt miles away from the quiet pastures of the Texas Valley, but for Arthur, it was the only place where the iron could be forged to crush the conspiracy against him. For a week, he remained holed up in a secure suite near Court Place, undergoing a battery of tests that would serve as his shield. Marcus Reynolds had arranged for a comprehensive, independent evaluation at a premier neurological institute in the city. Dr. Sandra Chen, a board-certified geriatrician with 20 years of high-stakes forensic experience, put Arthur through 4 brutal hours of examination. There were memory retention grids, complex logical reasoning exercises, physical coordination tests, advanced blood work panels, and high-resolution brain scans. When the final results were compiled, Arthur sat across from Dr. Chen in her quiet, sterile office. She looked up from the medical folder with a thin, genuinely impressed smile. "Mr. Pendleton," Dr. Chen said, tapping the documents, "I wish half of my patients, 20 years younger than you, possessed this level of cognitive acuity. Your neurological function scores land squarely in the 98th percentile for your age demographic. Your short-term and long-term memory metrics are pristine, and your executive decision-making skills are incredibly sharp. There is absolutely no clinical trace of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive degradation whatsoever." "Will you be willing to swear to those findings under oath in front of a district judge?" Arthur asked, his voice low and deliberate. "I'll do more than that," Dr. Chen replied confidently. "I will bring the raw diagnostic data to the stand myself. This paperwork isn't just an opinion, it's a scientific fact." Arthur walked out of the clinic feeling a profound sense of relief, but the war was only half won. While he was securing his medical fortress, Carla Summers had been tracking an entirely different paper trail, one that would turn their defense into a lethal criminal prosecution. The following morning, Arthur met Marcus and Carla in the firm's main conference room. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed the sprawling highway below, but Arthur's focus was entirely on the laptop screen Carla had spun toward him. "We knew they were desperate, Arthur, but we didn't realize they were completely underwater," Carla explained, pointing to a highlighted financial spreadsheet. "I ran a deep forensic sweep on Kevin and Chloe's personal banking accounts, credit histories, and corporate ties in Austin. It is an absolute disaster." She scrolled through the red, bleeding numbers. "They are carrying $31,000 in high-interest debt across 4 separate maxed-out credit cards. They have an auto loan on that luxury Escalade that is currently 3 consecutive payments behind, putting them at risk of immediate repossession. They even took out a predatory personal loan from an online lender for $4,000 at an astronomical 23% interest rate. Their total outstanding, uncollateralized debt is exactly $47,000. Arthur let out a low, grim whistle. "They aren't just greedy, they're drowning." "It gets even tighter," Carla continued, switching tabs to a legal notice. "Their high-end apartment lease in downtown Austin. They haven't paid a single dollar of rent in 2 months. Their landlord filed a formal eviction notice in housing court just last week. They are on the verge of being thrown onto the street." Suddenly, the frantic, aggressive arrival at the ranch house made absolute, chilling sense. This wasn't an organized corporate raid. It was a desperate, chaotic survival play. They had burned through every safety net they possessed, and they were clinging to Arthur's $5 million horse ranch like a life raft in a hurricane. Marcus Reynolds nodded grimly, tapping his pen against the oak table. "This gives us a definitive motive to present to Judge Catherine Holloway. It completely transforms their narrative of filial concern into a calculated, desperate scheme to commit massive financial fraud." "What is our immediate legal move, Marcus?" Arthur asked, his jaw tightening. "We aren't just filing an opposition to their temporary guardianship request," Marcus said, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. "We are filing a massive counter-petition. We are going on a full criminal offensive. We are alleging malicious harassment, civil conspiracy, and the attempted exploitation of an at-risk elderly adult, which, under Texas Penal Code, is a Class 3 felony. We are demanding a permanent injunction, immediate eviction from your property, and a total referral of the case file to the county sheriff for criminal prosecution." Arthur looked at the stack of documents, the medical clearance from Dr. Chen, and the financial ruin of his only son. He felt the phantom scent of smoke in his nose, the old instinct that told him a structure was about to collapse completely. "File it," Arthur said, standing up and adjusting his Stetson. "Let's head back to the valley. The hearing is in 3 days, and I want to be sitting on my porch when they realize the ground has completely opened up beneath their feet." The morning of the emergency hearing arrived under a heavy, charcoal-gray Texas sky, the distant rumble of thunder echoing over the peaks like artillery fire. Arthur sat quietly at the plaintiff's table inside the Travis County District Court, his hands clasped over the polished wood. Marcus Reynolds sat to his right, his eyes scanning the courtroom with cold precision. Behind them, across the aisle, sat Chloe and Kevin. Chloe was dressed in a sharp designer suit, her face a rigid mask of unyielding confidence. She still believed she held the upper hand, whispering aggressively into the ear of her newly hired attorney, a polished, expensive litigator named Randall Morgan, who specialized in aggressive estate asset seizures. Kevin sat beside her, staring blankly at his own hands, his face pale and entirely devoid of life. Judge Catherine Holloway presided over the bench. She was a silver-haired woman in her late 60s, known throughout the state for her razor-sharp legal mind and her absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her glasses, peering down at the thick stacks of filings before her. "We are here today to hear the matter of the emergency petition for involuntary guardianship filed against Mr. Arthur Pendleton," Judge Holloway began, her voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "Mr. Morgan, as counsel for the petitioners, you have the floor. State your case for immediate asset freeze and temporary guardianship." Randall Morgan rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket with practiced grace. "Thank you, Your Honor. My clients, Kevin and Chloe Pendleton, have taken this incredibly difficult step out of profound, painful necessity. Over the past 6 months, they have witnessed a severe, erratic degradation in Mr. Arthur Pendleton's cognitive abilities. He has exhibited extreme paranoia, cutting off vital household utilities, isolating himself from his family, and demonstrating a dangerous, unstable approach to managing a multi-million-dollar estate. We believe it is in the absolute best interest of the family to freeze all financial assets immediately until a permanent, court-appointed guardian can secure the estate." "Your Honor," Marcus Reynolds interrupted, rising calmly from his chair before Morgan could even take his seat. "Before opposing counsel continues his narrative, I would like to submit a comprehensive medical evaluation that completely and fundamentally hollows out the entire basis of their petition." Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Present it, Mr. Reynolds." Marcus stepped forward, handing copies of Dr. Sandra Chen's forensic neurological report to the judge and a visibly startled Randall Morgan. "This is a full cognitive assessment conducted less than 72 hours ago by Dr. Sandra Chen, one of the top geriatric specialists in the state. Her clinical findings are absolute. My client's cognitive function ranks in the 98th percentile for his age group. His memory, reasoning, and executive faculties are flawless. There is zero evidence of dementia or impairment. This petition is not based on medical concern, Your Honor. It is based on a calculated lie." The color visibly drained from Randall Morgan's face as he scrambled to scan the data pages. Chloe sat up straight, her eyes widening in sudden, manic panic. This is highly irregular, Your Honor," Morgan stammered, his polished demeanor fracturing. "We have had no adequate opportunity to review this independent report or challenge its methodology." "The report was officially filed into the court registry yesterday afternoon, Mr. Morgan," Judge Holloway said, her tone dripping with ice. "Perhaps you should have spent less time preparing your opening remarks, and more time reviewing the docket. Dr. Chen's credentials in this circuit are absolutely impeccable. Her methodology is flawless. Unless you have a counter-evaluation from a licensed physician who has actually examined Mr. Pendleton in person, I am inclined to accept these findings as absolute truth. Your Honor, my clients acted in absolute good faith based on behavioral observations. Morgan attempted to salvage the argument, but Marcus Reynolds pressed forward like a freight train. Good faith, Mr. Morgan? Marcus countered loudly, turning to face the defense table. Let the record show our counter-petition. We have submitted verified financial records, proving that petitioners are currently facing immediate eviction from their home, drowning in over $47,000 of high-interest debt, and are facing total financial ruin. Furthermore, we have submitted digital logs proving that Mrs. Chloe Pendleton spent the last 6 months doctor shopping across Texas, attempting to manufacture a fraudulent dementia diagnosis for financial gain. This wasn't an act of good faith. This was a calculated, criminal attempt to exploit an at-risk elderly adult under Texas law, a Class 3 felony. The courtroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The weight of the word felony shattered whatever composure Chloe had left. She leaned forward, her face contorting with rage, and hissed a string of frantic, panicked curses at her attorney. Randall Morgan looked at the medical data, then at the financial records, and finally at his own client. He realized within a fraction of a second that he had been brought into a legal suicide mission. Your Honor, Morgan said quickly, raising his hands in a defensive gesture, my firm was retained under the explicit representation that these claims were medically verified by the family. If there has been any misrepresentation or withholding of material facts by my clients regarding their financial motives or medical history, I had absolutely no prior knowledge of it. I acted entirely in reliance on what Mrs. Pendleton provided. He was throwing Chloe under the bus, completely and systematically, right in open court. Chloe stood up violently, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. That is a lie. You told me you could make this work. You said we could freeze his accounts within a week. This is ridiculous. We are his family. I was only trying to protect my husband's rightful inheritance from an old, senile man who... Mrs. Winston, sit down immediately. Judge Holloway's gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed like a rifle shot through the room. One more outburst from you, ma'am, and I will have the bailiff place you in immediate criminal contempt. You will speak only through your counsel, or you will not speak at all. The judge stared down at Chloe with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She studied the financial printouts and Dr. Chen's report for one final, agonizing minute. The court finds the emergency petition for guardianship to be entirely without merit, completely fraudulent, and maliciously filed, Judge Holloway declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. The petition is denied with prejudice. Furthermore, given the overwhelming evidence of premeditated financial deception and medical manipulation, I am officially referring the matter of Chloe Kelly Pendleton to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation into the attempted exploitation of an elder adult and filing false statements under oath. The gavel came down for the final time. Crack. The aftermath was a swift, silent demolition. Chloe was detained by court security for questioning before she could even reach the elevators. 2 weeks later, unable to afford Randall Morgan's exorbitant fees, she was appointed a public defender and accepted a plea deal to avoid jail time, receiving 4 years of intensive felony probation, a $15,000 restitution order to cover Arthur's legal fees, and a permanent, legally binding restraining order that barred her from ever stepping foot within 50 miles of the Pendleton Ranch. Randall Morgan faced a formal investigation by the Texas Bar Association, surrendering his corporate practice license 3 months later to avoid total disbarment. As for Kevin, the prosecutor dropped all potential conspiracy charges after he agreed to cooperate fully and testify against his wife, but the damage to his relationship with his father was absolute. On the morning of his departure from the ranch, Kevin stood in the kitchen, a packed duffel bag at his feet. He looked small, deflated, and completely stripped of his arrogant veneer. He stared out the window at the mountains, his hands trembling as he held a cold cup of coffee. "The car is packed, Dad," Kevin murmured, not turning around. "I'm heading back to Austin. The apartment is gone, but I found a small room to rent on the outskirts. I talked to a local shipping yard. I'm starting as a night shift logistics dispatcher next Monday. Pushing crates, managing manifests, starting from the bottom." "Good," Arthur said, his voice quiet, steady, and devoid of the old warmth, yet lacking any remaining anger. Kevin finally turned around, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, heavy sorrow. Do you think there's any chance for us? For a relationship? Down the road?" Arthur looked at his son, really looked at him. The boy who used to sprint across the lawn to catch him after a brutal shift was buried deep beneath the wreckage of the last 7 years. "The door isn't locked forever, Kevin," Arthur said deliberately. "I told you that before. But you need to earn your way back into this family. Start by fixing your own life. Pay off your debts. Rebuild your own self-respect. Come back to this ranch in 1 year as a completely independent man who has found his own spine, and we'll talk." Kevin nodded slowly, a single tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. 1 year. I'll prove it to you, Dad. Thank you for not giving up on me completely." Arthur watched from the wide timber porch as Kevin's modest rental car drove down the gravel driveway, disappearing past the white picket gates and into the vast Texas horizon. He turned and walked back inside, pouring himself a fresh, hot cup of black coffee. The months passed in a beautiful, predictable rhythm. Summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn, and the leaves of the valley oaks turned brilliant shades of crimson and amber against the mountains. Arthur went back to his routine, training his thoroughbred horses in the crisp mornings, reading his leather-bound historical journals by the roaring fireplace, and enjoying quiet dinners with his neighbors. One morning, as the first frost of winter frosted the edges of the porch railing, Arthur sat in his rocking chair, watching a golden hawk soar high above the valley, completely unbothered by the cold wind. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Vivian, the neighbor from down the valley, making that slow roasted brisket recipe you loved tonight. "Dinner at 6. Don't be late." Arthur smiled, his fingers typing out a swift reply. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. I'll bring the good whiskey." He slipped the phone back into his denim jacket, leaning back against the sturdy oak timbers of his home. He looked out at the rolling pastures, his horses, his land, his life, everything he had spent a lifetime building, and everything he had possessed the iron will to protect. The structure had taken a hit, the smoke had cleared, but the foundation remained.